Philip, since you had to suffer so much now, let me start with you. How is Germany ensuring its industries stay competitive while decarbonizing? What have you done in the past to bridge the cost gap for emerging climate technologies? And if I may ask you also, what has the future government to do?
Well, I mean, Michael has shown us the cost curves of renewables, and of course, renewables are one of the possibilities to bring down costs. That's actually a no-brainer in a way. On the other hand, of course, one has to say, and that was not on the chart, of course, that the infrastructure is actually adding cost, of course. Transmission grids, of course, are very costly. We are speaking about more than 300 billion euros, so that adds up. But of course, in the long run, this will actually help tremendously to bring down costs. For transitionary period, we will need to have some subsidies, targeted subsidies as well, to bring down costs. We are talking about network tariffs, bringing them down. That will be necessary as well. And then, of course, we need a resilient energy system as a whole, of course, which is diversified and which relies on different pillars. And I think in Germany, we had to make that experience, of course, becoming independent of the Russian gas. We heard a little bit about that on the last panel.
Jens, let's talk a little bit about technology priorities for the energy transition. Which technologies are currently most critical, in your opinion, for accelerating the energy transition?
None of them.
Yeah, try this one, maybe?
No, not yet. Maybe just you continue talking and then we realize which microphone works.
So there.
Yeah.
This sounds good.
Now we're talking. So you still remember the question?
Yes.
Good.
There are probably two answers to that. The one is what are the things that are and there we see three very major dynamics that reshape energy systems. If you look at the global energy system as a whole, this currently consists of roughly.
They do that on purpose to show how many microphones there are. So that's the reason, you know.
Technology.
Now we get it. So sorry again.
So directionally, one third electricity, 2/3 molecule. Now we're still growing, so energy demand fundamentally will scale this. Now there are three dynamics that are happening that really change this equation. One is efficiency is accelerating, so we can do the same thing with less energy. The second one is that renewables are scaling massively everywhere in the world, faster than any energy carrier in history. So electrons are getting greener. The third one is that we're electrifying. So we're increasing the share of electrons in the overall energy system and making it easier to decarbonize. Those are the three things that are happening everywhere in the world, relatively independent of regulation at different paces. But this is what works economically right now, and that happens everywhere. That does not mean that this is all that's important to scale. We've seen before that we have to solve challenges across many different sectors with very many different technologies. We have one asset generation to do that. That means we need to invest in all of them.
From your experience at Heidelberg Materials, Katharina, do you agree to that, what Jens just said?
Yes, I do. So I agree on the 3 points that you had, and I agree on the fact that we need far more technologies to industrialize, scale, and reach business cases to be able to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sector. Coming from Heidelberg Materials, depending on which study you take, we are the biggest emitter in Germany. And cement is, after water, the second most material used in the world. So there's very likely no future without cement, and especially...
And the possibility of a great impact.
Yes, and there's a huge possibility for great impact. Having that said, for the decarbonization of cement, there are classical levers you can pull and work on that we are working on since a long time, that is using alternative fuels in the clinker production. So actually the heavy emitting part during the cement production is when you produce the clinker. It's that part that makes cement strong and that creates its characteristics. So for this process, you need fuels. Traditionally, that's coal. So using alternative fuels is one part. But actually, the bigger part in the cement production is the fact that the process itself emits CO2 because it's based on limestone. And when you burn the limestone at a very high temperature, the fact is that the CO2 comes out of the limestone, meaning that our process produces a very high emitting CO2 stream. Now, we have the traditional levers that bring this down, but then we end with a huge chunk which just comes out of the process. And there's literally no other current available technology than carbon capture and storage to get rid of this huge part, process emitted emissions. Now we will introduce our first large-scale, industrial-scale carbon capture plant in Norway, in Brevik, this year, where we do, as a first of its kind, carbon capture and storage and store in Northern Lights. To get to zero carbon cement, and that will be introduced into the market in 2025.
Okay, thank you. Philip, in your perspective, are we focusing on the right mix of solutions right now, or are there any key technologies being overlooked?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know if we overlook technologies, because as a government, I hope not to have to choose technologies actually, but to just actually offer a regulatory framework actually, which makes industry thrive actually, and for them to be able to develop their technologies. The problem a little bit is that actually the industry, I mean, you know, on panels like that, there's very often the discussion, oh, let's just talk about targets, like, let's get rid of micromanagement, of red tape and so on. But then if I'm in the office, the same people come to me and say, oh, I need a little subsidy, I would like to have a little regulation here in order to actually have this transition going on. And I mean, that's fair enough. Of course, if we talk about the energy transition, because if you have market failure, and we do see market failures in many areas, like, I mean, the cement industry, I think, is a very good example. If you want to decarbonize that with direct reduction facilities or CCS, I mean, this costs a lot of money.
Yes.
In Germany, we do think that we do need to subsidize this for a transitionary period, of course. But at the end of the day, we need a regulatory framework which is really as simple as possible. There I can concur. Of course, CO2 price is, in our opinion, I would even say, is key. But of course, it's politically very, very hard actually to sustain the prices which actually drive change. So for at least like a transitional period, once again, we do need incentives as well. In order to decarbonize industry and to get the mix right. You know, that's really the problem. And I would love not to have to make technological decisions, you know, what to subsidize, but it's just not possible at this very moment. So therefore, we have to kind of try to get the balance right, actually, of sticks and carrots, basically. But to do, and then Mariana Mazzucato, others, they say mission-oriented policy making. Well, we try, but at the end of the day, it's very hard in practice.
Jens, you were smiling a little bit during the last minute. Why? And what's your take on the question? Are there any key technologies which might be overlooked these days?
I smiled not because I thought...
Because you're a happy person.
I am. No, the reason I smiled was less because I think there are major technologies we overlook. But what I at least think is that we have curious priorities in accelerating this transformation in Europe. If you look at the macroeconomic effect that this has, sector by sector, in power, you have an industry that can't move away. There's no carbon leakage. And we replace resources, as we learned earlier, that we have to import from another place with capital goods that we produce at home. That creates growth. In buildings, it's exactly the same. We replace imported Russian gas with heat pumps. Building renovation creates growth. Transport is a bit more complex because we have a very strong automotive industry that's, of course, threatened by the technology transformation. But I would at least argue that we have to be early in this transformation to help our industry succeed in the new technology that will make up the majority of the market going forward. Where this transition is the biggest risk is in industry, where you have international competition, where you often have relatively substantial cost increases through more expensive green energy.
Yes.
And now if you look across those fields, where we accelerate most in Europe is in an ETS regulation that penalizes the area of our economy that is most in danger, where we have long accelerated very slowly is in the areas that actually create growth. And in China, they do it exactly the other way around.
What I hear the biggest in your opinion, Jens, the biggest, the question goes to everybody then, of you, the biggest roadblocks preventing large-scale adoption of clean technologies? What are the biggest roadblocks? You want to start first, and then maybe Katharina and then Philip?
It's a bit different technology by technology. So for things that are economic, renewables, electrification, by the way, also by country, in China, zero. Here, traditionally, a lot of bureaucracy in building new things, a lack of infrastructure that can integrate renewables or e-cars, and a surprising amount of public resistance against most of these technologies. For things like hydrogen and CCUS, so far, economics. And this is something that has to be where the cost gap has to be bridged.
Okay. Katharina?
Yeah, if I may take it from there, I completely agree that it's very regional dependent. If I look at Europe, the thing that is most complicated, to be honest, is the business case. And I'm a true believer that all these sustainability and transition cases only work if there's a business case behind it, and the business case will take time, and we need industrialization and scaling, and in the meantime, it still needs to work for the private sector, because otherwise our shareholders will leave us, which would be very unfortunate. So I think the first thing is that we need to find ways to make the business case work. And then obviously the whole discussion around how fast are permits, how long does it take to get certifications, how long does it take to be able to store CO2 in Germany, taking into consideration that we do have 3 CCS projects in the build-up in Germany, but we don't have the legislation to be able to then really store it. All of that makes it very difficult for the private sector and makes it even more difficult for the business case.
So, Philip, if I may push it a little bit further, what policy, what regulatory changes are needed, in your opinion, to make these technologies a bit more viable?
Well, I mean, first I would agree with Jens. Of course, it depends a little bit on the sector. Of course, yes. I mean, it's a little bit difficult to have a catch-all recipe. It would be the silver bullet or the golden bullet. It's a bit difficult. I mean, certainly what we need is, of course, we need, and you mentioned it. I mean, we need to accelerate planning procedures, permitting. And that's what we have been doing in Germany, actually. I mean, when we managed actually to set up FSRU terminals within less than a year, and actually taking the experiences from this area, we are implementing it everywhere, and this is what we get here from industry as well. By now, it's not the permits which are a problem anymore for the build-up of transmission grids and so on, but it's really supply-side bottlenecks and stuff like that. And of course, that goes along with, of course, cutting as much as possible, of course, all kinds of bureaucracy and micromanagement aspects. But then it very often comes down, especially, and there, I mean, Jens, on the last panel we had the pleasure to be together. You made that point as well, and I thought a lot about it. Are we prioritizing it the wrong way? Are we really going on the industry sector only, and is that maybe the wrong way? I mean, the point is, I mean, we have been actually reaping all the low-hanging fruits already, actually, especially, and we have been focusing very much on the power sector, actually. I mean, many say, rightly so, that the Energiewende, the German Energiewende, was mainly an electron-centered exercise, and that is pretty true. So I'm afraid if we are to reach our targets, you know, the Paris targets, if we want to become climate neutral by 45, then we actually have to address the whole spectrum. And of course, since industry does play such an important role in Germany, we have to also put that into perspective. And then once again, with the right mix of incentives, of course, and regulatory conditions, which actually make it possible that we don't see a carbon leakage and that we remain in an industrially strong country.
Philip, I said in the beginning, tomorrow in a week there is the election for a new Bundestag. If you look at your own ministry, the Ministry of Economy and Climate Action, what, in your words and from your perspective, were the biggest successes of the last 3 years, and what was the biggest failure?
I would certainly say so. I mean, securing energy security. I mean, after the dropout of the Russian gas, I mean, it was more than
managing basically that there is energy.
That there is energy. That actually we managed to not have energy. The gas too little gas actually to keep the industry running and so on. That was, and of course not only gas but energy in general, being so dependent on Russian gas. Whilst at the same time, and I think this is really important actually, accelerating the energy transition, really speeding up permitting procedures and really speeding up the deployment of renewables. We see really a radical build up of new permits, of actually the build up of solar, of wind, actually really skyrockets really. We have seen last year more than 15 megawatt new permits of solar. Wind is following now. This is really taking off. So I really thinking combining like securing energy, the energy security in the light of the Russian aggression on Ukraine and the repercussions on Germany, at the same time speeding up Energiewende. What was the biggest failure, if you may? Of course, I mean, there's a threat of losing public acceptance for this, and you can see it everywhere, which is probably related to the question of how people are affected of prices. I mean, we have probably not managed to bring down prices as much as necessary for the consumer as well as for the industry. I mean, the discussion about the Industriestrompreis, the price for electricity in the industry sector, I think is like really the best example for that.
So that implies that the major failure, in your opinion, was just communication.
No, it's not only communication. I think that would be too simplistic. I mean, that would be maybe communication as well, but also, of course, I mean now, I would say we have actually reaped like all the low-hanging fruits. Now it gets really, I mean, and Jens has made the point. I mean, like 2/3 of our energy consumption and energy consumption is still molecules. You know, it's only 1/3 which is electrons. And molecules are so much more difficult because then you have to go to the traffic sector, into the heating cellars, the famous heating law, the Heizungsgesetz, and of course also have to turn towards industry, and that is so much more difficult. Like the hydrogen economy we are trying to build, or the hydrogen pillar of the decarbonized economy, shows how difficult things are.
Jens, let's move into another topic. Are there any examples of corporations in the field of public-private partnerships which accelerate the deployment of critical climate solutions?
I think there are quite a lot.
What are the most important to know for us?
So the ones that
and from which we can draw some lessons.
That to me come to mind immediately are in Sweden and other regions of the Nordics, the climate partnerships, where the government initiated roundtables with every individual industrial sector.
Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that so that we can draw the lessons here and say, maybe you focus on 1 or 2 examples and show us exactly why it worked and what we can learn here or in other regions from that example.
3 come to mind. One are the Nordic climate partnerships. How they were set up is that I think the first country that adopted them was Sweden. They initiated roundtables with every individual major industrial sector to understand what the sector needs in terms of regulation and in terms of support to move to net zero. And out of this, they developed sector-specific regulation and support schemes that, among other things, enabled early projects in CCUS, that, among other things, enabled the first non-fossil steel production in the world. In my view, an amazing scheme, a bit more difficult to implement in a country like Germany, where the cement sector is not one plant, but a whole industry. But still, I think as a role model, extremely good to apply. The second one that comes to mind is the Dutch CCS projects, where the government sat together with infrastructure providers, major emitters, and oil and gas players with depleted fields in the North Sea to discuss how to build up infrastructure, capture and storage, and coordinate this all together, and how a regulatory support scheme would have to look like to enable that. As a result, the Netherlands will have one of the most dynamic CCS industries in the world. The third one, I feel, you didn't mention that as a credit of your ministry, are the German climate contracts, which is a scheme that this outgoing government put in place to bridge the cost gap in major industrial decarbonization projects, where companies can bid in auctions with own decarbonization plans, and the government will bridge the cost gap between the actual cost and the fossil alternative. Those three things, I think, are. And the last one, we have to see how well it's adopted, but my impression is that that it has been adopted quite well in the first round. But I think those three are examples that I feel are extremely successful, that I think we can adopt more broadly across Europe. Because what I do feel that each of these have in common is that they were thought very nationally so far. And in my view, a lot of these are things that we should think a lot more continental from a European perspective.
It's going to be the job of Boston Consulting Group to push that in other regions as well then, and then you can teach that to your clients. I hope so, at least. Katharina, let's talk about your company a bit more. What are, in your opinion, the biggest challenges in decarbonizing hard-to-abate industry? You mentioned that before, like cement. I think renaming the company from Heidelberg Cement to Heidelberg Materials is just the first step.
Yes, no, you are completely right. So I think all hard-to-abate sectors have the part which is very much dependent on energy and on an energy price for green energy that helps the adoption, because that's I think in all of these industry one major topic. What's the price for green energy? So that's one very important part. Then, I mean, other than that, it's very different in the different hard-to-abate industries what the different levers are. As in our case, as I said, there are conventional levers, and then there are CCS as the broader, as the final lever, so to say. And if I look at where we are in Europe and where the ETS is and how we think it's going to progress, it does mean that for an industry like ours, which is a very, very local industry because you cannot transport cement, it actually means that we will have to build carbon capture and storage facilities in lots of different parts of Europe, because that's going to be the only way to decarbonize broad scale. The other thing is that we need schemes to be able to work with this decarbonized cement, be it book and claim mechanisms to be actually able to really sell it, and mechanisms to certify that the product is net carbon zero. So all of this is in the making. I think for the company itself, it's complicated because there's so much uncertainty in the process. And for example, you talked about the contracts for difference. It's very important that we have stable conditions, because the private sector has to make big decisions on FIDs and on investment, And for that, we need a regulatory framework as well as a subsidy framework, which is comparably stable, because otherwise we will not be able to get to these decisions.
Over there sits Helmut Schönenberger, and he stands for Unternehmertum, and Unternehmertum stands for a lot of initiatives, as we heard before.
Yes.
One of those initiatives is the so-called Circular Republic initiative. And I'm saying and mentioning that because another gentleman yesterday from Climeworks was here on stage, and they stand for carbon capturing. I'd like to know, in your opinion, how critical are those two topics? One is circular economy principles, or implementing circular economy principles. The other one is carbon direct air capturing in achieving net zero in those sectors we have spoken about. Is that something that is kind of 10 years down the road? Is that something that is, in your opinion, an overlooked technology? Maybe you can comment a little bit on that in a few words, because we have just 5 minutes left.
Okay. So the circular economy, in my view, is extremely helpful because it makes our problem smaller.
Somebody's nodding there.
Every shred of material we don't have to produce from scratch. We don't have to decarbonize production for, and decarbonizing production of base materials is among the most expensive thing that we do in this whole transformation. So the more circular we become, the smaller, especially the very expensive parts of this whole decarbonization journey get. One, two, and I think that's often a bit overlooked from an industrial policy perspective. Europe is a continent that's extremely poor in resources. So a lot of the base materials for our material industry sectors we need to import. We are not a continent that's poor in waste. So whatever we recycle in terms of industrial value creation will stay here.
Katharina.
I completely agree. So circularity, especially in the cement industry, is very important because cement is 100% recyclable. And every bit that we get out of demolition waste is something that we don't have to get out of quarries and national resources. On the topic of direct air capture, I think that's a very advanced technology. So if you look at what direct air capture does, it sucks the CO2 out of the air and stores it under the ground. We have currently an intensity of CO2 in the air of 421 parts per million. So this is a very, very, very low intensity stream. If you compare it, for example, to the CO2 stream that we see in cement, which is between 15 and 25%, there are worlds in between. And that means that direct air capture does need even unbelievable far more energy than we need to do carbon capture and storage in cement. So I think there are lots of technologies that are lower hanging fruits in terms of energy consumption. And I still believe that direct air capture in the long run is a viable option, because everywhere where you have access, for example, to geothermal.
What means long run?
In the long run?
Just give us a number or a corridor.
2035, maybe. I mean, you see, I'm often talking to Climeworks because I know Christoph pretty well, and when I discuss it with him, I know that he can sell every single bit that he is now basically producing. Every certificate he can produce, he can sell. So there is a market for that. But if we get to scaling of these technologies, where we look at carbon capture of very, very low intensity stream, I think it'll take time, and we first have to make sure that we have all the options to capture the very high intensity streams.
And is it a real, sorry to interrupt you, is it a real market, or is it a kind of an artificial market, because it's very much driven by regulation as well, the CO2 price?
You know what, I think right now it is driven by, so the big tech companies are willing to pay high prices for CO2 certificates because of the commitments that they gave, and because of what's happening in the data center arena. I think the data center development completely changed the market and completely changed their carbon footprint, and this is why they are very interested in all options to decarbonize, including very expensive schemes. Is that artificial? I think, in a way, I think it doesn't matter whether it's artificial or not.
At least it is the market.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we do need a global CO2 price because that's one way to make sure that we globally stay competitive, so that we don't only increase prices in parts of the world. So,
Philip, what's your political view on that?
I mean, I think on circular economy, I couldn't agree more. On direct air capture, I mean, obviously, I'm listening to what the experts say. I mean, my feeling is it's something not quite ready now. And regulation, of course, is key. And I mean, at least for Germany, I think if you're talking about refineries and so on, I think we need to look at the regulation and maybe decide, do we really remain ideologically pure, or do we change the regulation a little bit to be able to use maybe some more CO2 we are having anyway. If I may add two things very briefly. I mean, on best practices, of course, there are many. I would add actually like the German hydrogen core network, the financing mechanism, which is a private financing mechanism, intertemporal cost allocation, which is actually being looked at in other countries as well. And more generally, I mean, I think we're talking about opportunity for technology openness. I think, of course, like instruments which are like maybe not technologically neutral, but at least open, I think are very much to encourage. And of course, carbon contracts for difference, for example, are technologically neutral, or just like regulation, which just actually provides the targets and don't actually decrease how to reach them. I think that's really where we should, what we should try to do, knowing that it's not always possible in practice.
Thank you very much for this panel. Thank you very much for the conversation. And I think this applause, which hopefully comes now, is for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to know.